Thank you so much. And I'm very lucky to be here, and I'm very honored to be in your community. And what I want to do is I want to start out today with a puzzle, something that has mystified scientists and educators for years. And the puzzle is that for more than 3 decades, we've been teaching students in school that the way to become more creative is to think in patterns. But over those same 3 decades, students have not been getting more creative. In fact, they've been getting less creative. Why? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through a little tour of history to answer that question and then give you a potential answer to it in case you happen to know any kids in school. Our tour starts with the US Army, take you back to World War II. The US Army decided that they could win the war a lot faster if they were more creative. So they decided to hire this man, J.P. Guilford, to crack the code of creativity so that every soldier in the US Army could learn how to be more creative. And Guilford started with what was then a very radical idea, which was that the brain was a computer. And because of that, he reduced creativity to 2 processes: divergent thinking and convergent thinking. Divergent thinking is brainstorming. It's randomly associating ideas in your mind. And convergent thinking is identifying patterns in those random ideas, patterns that you can iterate. So this is where we get the idea that creativity is driven by patterns. Guilford's theory of divergent and convergent thinking is known now as ideation. It's the basis of design thinking, which is very pattern-driven, and it is how generative AI works. Those 2 computational processes. And so that's why if you look at computer-generated poetry or art, you'll notice it's very pattern-driven. So of course we've solved creativity. We cracked the code. That's all there is to it, except if you've ever used AI, you might have noticed it's not really that creative. And you remember that problem I was talking about, that puzzle I was talking about at the beginning? Children getting less creative when they're taught to think like this? Well, this is also something that the US Army noticed. The US Army started to notice that this training that they were giving to soldiers was making them less creative. And about 10 years ago, United States Army Special Operations started looking for an answer. They said, there's got to be a different way to train creativity. And about 4 years ago, they ran into me. It was a very strange encounter. I'm not an Army guy. I'm actually get nauseous at the thought of violence, so it was a difficult first encounter. But we got over that. We learned that people can be different and can be friends. And we embarked on this new research program, which, as you heard, resulted in my team being awarded this Commendation Medal for groundbreaking research. And the Army said that we had developed the first new theory of creativity since World War II. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share that with you to see if you're as impressed as the Army is. Because, obviously, the Army is easy to impress, right? Are you easy to impress? So what we did is we started by rethinking Guilford's premise. Guilford said we all think like a computer. We said, no, actually, you know what we think like? We think like neurons. These are what are actually in our brain. How do neurons think? Well, it turns out neurons don't think in logic. They think in story. When I say this, sometimes people look at me, I got some nods here, which I really appreciate. Thank you for that affirmation. A lot of times when I say that, people look at me like I'm totally nuts. Like, what? Neurons think in story? You can prove this to yourself if you want to be a scientist yourself. Go spend some time with a young child, a child who hasn't spent much or any time in school. What you will notice is they role play. They imagine themselves as characters on adventures in different worlds. They think in story. And why is that important? Well, it's important because story operates in exactly the opposite way of patterns in computers. With a story, what you do is you notice something that's exceptional, something that's unique, and then you double down on it. You find a weird person, and you put them on a quest. You started to do this a little bit in that exercise outside, where you were encouraged to notice exceptions, things that were unusual in those pictures. And I'm going to run you through 3 simple examples from art, from tech and science, just so you can get a sense of how it works, and then we're going to roll on to trying to do it ourselves. So we'll start with art. It's a very famous painting, one of the most influential paintings in the history of color. It's by Titian. It's from the Renaissance. And what made this painting so influential was its use of color. It strikes you immediately, its use of color. And of course, what most of you will see immediately is the blue, and then the green, and you'll notice the red as well, just these kind of striking colors. And so this set the pattern for color for the next 300 years in art. But remember, where does creativity come? It comes from breaking patterns. It's from noticing exceptions and doubling down on them. And in the 19th century, a young painter noticed an exception to these 3 big colors, and that exception was yellow. You can see a little bit of yellow in here, but it's very muted. Well, this painter thought, what if I took that exception and doubled down? What if I took yellow and made it everywhere? Van Gogh's Sunflowers. It's that easy. You can be Van Gogh. I'll give you another example, this time from technology. This from technology. So now, at the end of the 19th century, here's another exception to a rule. This thing is known as the AC motor. It's an electric motor, but it was the first motor to run on alternating current. At the time, all electric motors ran on something called DC, direct current, which had been pioneered by Thomas Edison, who was a very important person and liked you to know it. And so this was considered to be a rogue, an outlier, a weirdo, a freak. And then along came an engineer who thought, what if I took this motor and I doubled down? What if I took this motor and I made it everywhere? And that young inventor was Tesla. And that's why all of the motors that you use in your life run on AC. This building runs on AC. This city runs on AC. That was how he created that change. He saw the exception. He doubled down. Last example, my favorite example, Marie Curie. Now, when she was a scientist, the rule was that the smallest thing in the world was the atom. And there could be nothing inside the atom. She noticed an exception. The exception was radioactivity. That was energy coming from inside the atom. And so while all the other scientists in the world were trying to explain away that exception, Marie Curie thought, what if I doubled down? What if I made that exception the new rule? What if the energy inside the atom was everywhere? You have the Big Bang, and you have modern physics. So what I want us to do now is I want to practice using this method ourselves, this natural way of being creative, this way that we're creative when we're a child. And I'm going to run you through a simple exercise that activates this part of your brain. This is the motor cortex. And we call the exercise shift to narrative. And the way it works is this. I want you to start by thinking of a person you know well. It could be a friend, it could be a family member, it could be someone you've read a lot of books about. And then think about a positive label you attach to that person. So maybe they're kind, or they're wise, or they're creative. Now, when we attach those positive labels, we're being complimentary. But we're also thinking like a computer. Because that's what a computer does. A computer tags things. It labels them. Why? Because computers think in patterns. And it wants to take that individual and categorize them with a bunch of others. So we're going to now break that pattern. We're going to break that label. And how do we do that? I want you to hold that person in your mind and hold that positive quality in your mind and think back in history to a specific time when they embodied that quality. What was something that they did that was kind or wise or creative? And once you've got that story in your mind, once you can feel that energy, tell it forward into the future. Imagine something wise or kind or creative they might do tomorrow. I'll give you an example from my own life. It's my son, Ronan. As you can see, he's very creative. So what's a story from the past when my son was creative? Well, I think back to when he was in first grade, and back in first grade, his teachers were all very concerned because he was behind in reading and writing. And when I say he was behind in reading and writing, what I mean is he couldn't read and he couldn't write. And so he was 6 months behind everyone in his class. And then he was a year behind everyone in his class. And then he was 2 years behind. And the teachers were getting very anxious, and we were getting very anxious. And he could see that we were getting very anxious. So one day he comes into my office. He says, "Dad, don't worry. I'm going to write." I said, "Okay. I'm going to write a book." All right? "What are you going to write this book about?" "I'm going to write this book about Red." Now, Red was his friend, his fish he kept in a tank in his room. He's going to write a book about his friend, Red. So I said, "Okay." And he gets this big pile of papers off my desk, and he takes it upstairs, and he puts it next to the fish tank. He says, "I'm going to write this book for Red." Great. Next day, no words on any of those pieces of paper. 2 days, 3 days, a week, no words. 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month, 3 months, not a word has been written. And then Red passes away. Red dies. And heartbreaking, but of course my first thought was, oh my goodness, my son never got a chance to write that book. He's going to be so guilty. So the first thing I do is I run upstairs before my son can get to his bedroom, and I take those pieces of paper and carry them out of the room, and I hide them so he doesn't see them, so he doesn't feel bad. My son comes home. He's heartbroken to learn that Red is dead. He goes up, spends some time in his room, does his thing. We leave him alone. Then I come in a little bit later, and I notice that he's looking a little bit happier. And then I notice that these weird markings on the wall next to Red's fish tank. I'm like, what? I go over and I realize those markings are words. I'm like, how did those words get there? Because, I mean, my son doesn't create words. He doesn't know how to write. But of course, he had written. And what he had written was this: Ronan and Red Forever Room. Poetry. Poetry. So that's what I think of when I think of my son being creative. I think of that story. And that story has come in useful to me many times in my own life when I've needed to be creative, not least of which when the Army sat me down and said, "Well, Professor Fletcher, we're very impressed by this new theory. What we need is a huge training manual filled with dozens and dozens and dozens of creative thinking exercises." And I said, "You must have me confused with somebody else because I'm a scientist, I'm not a creative, I don't like invent training exercises." And they said, "No, you're going to invent this book." And so, what did I do? I thought like my son. I thought, how does he create? How would he create in that moment? And that was how I created the Army's field guide, by thinking like my son, and that is the field guide that went on to win that medal. So that is shift to narrative. That's how it breaks patterns. You start by thinking of an individual person who you label. You think back, what's the story that birthed that label? And then you think, what would that person do now? I'm going to end by returning to where I started with the problem of our schools. Schools are more important to me than the Army. And I can't tell you that we have solved this problem, but I can tell you that we've taken the same training that we developed with the Army, and we've put it into high schools, middle schools, and elementary schools with the help of Worthington Schools here. We've run scientific trials, and we've published peer-reviewed research, and we've shown that the same training works. And because that training encourages young children to think like Van Gogh, like Tesla, like Curie, like artists, like engineers, like scientists, it doesn't just increase their creativity, it increases their self-efficacy and their resilience, because it makes them realize that creativity isn't just something you do with finger paints, it's what you use to solve real problems. It's what you use to innovate. So if you're interested in that research, you can find it in the Journal of Creativity. So give shift to narrative a try. It works for soldiers. It works for students. It can work for you, because creativity is more than a pattern, and your brain is more than a computer. Thank you.